Hi guys, me again. So, this is going to be the second half of the second chapter of While the Whales Came by Michael Morpurgo. And I think we left off here last time I was reading to you, so here we go. I promise, I said, I'll stay away. And so I did, for a day or so at least. It took only that long for Daniel to persuade me to go back with him to Rushy Bay that we'd been silly to run away in the first place just because we'd heard a donkey braying. I told him everything Father had told me about the Birdman and Samson and Charlie Webber. He listened, but I could tell he didn't really believe any of it. He said that he'd heard something about the fire before, and it didn't make matter anyway because we weren't going to Samson like Charlie Webber did. We were only going to Rushy Bay, and the Birdman might be a bit loony, but what did that matter? He just wanted to make friends. That was all. Why else would he give us our boat back? Why else would he be leaving messages for us in the sand? We didn't have to go anywhere near him, did we? Perhaps I agreed to go with Daniel because I was half convinced by his arguments, or perhaps I was just inquisitive. When I crawled up over Samson Hill with Daniel the next day, I kept flat on my stomach in the heather until I was sure that the Birdman was not down there on Rushy Bay waiting for us. The Birdman was not waiting for us, but something else was. Lying on its side in the sand, in almost the same spot we had found our boats the day before, was a bird, a cormorant. At first we thought it had been washed up dead, for it lay amongst the flotsam at the high water mark. As we approached, I could see it was small even for a young bird, and that the feathers were not oily black as they should have been. I thought it must have been blown off the rocks before it could fly. Suddenly, Daniel caught my arm and pointed further along the beach. A trail of footprints led right to where the cormorant lay, and away again. At that moment I would have panicked and run, as I had done before, but this time Daniel's hand was firm on my arm, and he led me forward. In the sand, above the cormorant, written out in orange shells, were the letters I now expected to find. Z.W. It was not until we were down on our knees in the sand beside it that I realised the cormorant's feathers were not stirred by the breeze as they ought to have been, that it was in fact made of wood. Then we noticed the shells. Only a few feet away, the shells along the tide mark had been arranged to read, "Stay and play. Your beach as much as mine." We scanned the dunes above us for any sign of this black sou'wester amongst the reeds, but all we could see of the Birdman were his gulls still lined up on the thatch of his cottage watching us. Thin wisps of smoke rose from the chimney pots at each end of the cottage, only to be whipped away at once, dissipated by the wind. Daniel reached out and picked up the cormorant. The base of it was carved out of the rock, covered in limpets and barnacles, and the cormorant stood on its great webbed feet, head slightly lifted, almost indignant. He was leaning forwards as if balancing himself against the wind. All his feathers were so finely crafted that I expected them to be soft to the touch. Daniel set the bird down in the wet sand, facing out over the water to Samson, and sat back on his ankles. "You ever seen anything like it?" he said, stroking the crown of the bird's head. "Looks as if it could lift off and fly, doesn't he?" "Do you think the Birdman's watching us?" I whispered. "Expect so," said Daniel. "Don't mind if he is. Look at this, Gracie. The man who made this isn't a madman. He just can't be. And he gave us back our boat, didn't he? It's like I told you, Gracie, he's trying to make friends with us. He likes us being here. I'm going to stay and sell our boats, Gracie, just like he said we could. And what's more, I'm going to say thank you to him." "Well, I'm not going anywhere near that cottage," I said, suddenly cold with fear at the thought of it. "Not in a million years." "We don't need to, Gracie," he said. "Look." And he wrote in shells beside the Birdman's message. "Thanks, Daniel and Grace." "No," I shouted as soon as I saw my name in the sand. "You can't. He'll know who we are if you do that. He'll come after us and put curses on us." And I lifted my foot and kicked the sand all over Daniel's writing until I had obliterated every last letter. I was crying in spite of myself. "Father said he put spells on people. We mustn't talk to him. We're not supposed to." Daniel looked up at me and I could see from the look in his eyes that he was disappointed. "But we're not going to talk to him, are we?" he said. "Look, Gracie, it stands to reason. If the Birdman wanted to put a spell on us, he'd have done it already, wouldn't he? Well, he could, couldn't he?" I would not answer him because I hated to be wrong, and I knew well enough in my heart that I was. In my shame and fury, I kicked the cormorant over on its side and ran up the beach towards Samson Hill. Daniel called after me to come back, and all my rage at my own humiliating fear burst from me. "If you're so brave, Daniel Pender," I screamed at him, "then you can sign this silly name, but I'm not coming here again, never, you hear me? Never! You keep your silly boats and your silly cormorant for all I care. I don't want it, and I don't want ever..." And I would have gone on to say every hurtful thing I could think of had I not caught sight of the birdman's dog plodding purposefully along the beach behind Daniel, his tongue lolling out of his mouth. I tried to call out to Daniel, warn him, but my voice would not speak as it should, so I just pointed and ran back over the sand to warn him. The dog paid us no attention, but went straight to where the cormorant lay and sniffed it. Then, arranging his jaws with care around it, he picked it up and came and sat tidily at our feet, looking very pleased with itself, his tail swishing in the sand behind him. The dog seemed to have no eyes, for they were covered by a curtain of matted grey ringlets. "He's giving it to you," he said. "He wants you to take it." "For us, is it?" Daniel asked the dog, and he took the cormorant out of its mouth. "Did he send you then? Did the birdman send you?" And the dog licked its lips and shook the sand out of its mouth. Daniel patted him and parted the hair over his face to reveal two shining black eyes. "How can you see through all this lot?" he said. And then the dog pricked up his ears, stood up, looked towards the cottage. He stopped panting for a moment and listened. Before we knew he was bounding away over the sand and had vanished into the dunes. Neither of us had even heard a whistle, but neither of us had any doubt at all that he had been called back. "Must have been watching us," I said. "He must have seen me kick it over, mustn't he?" Daniel brushed the sand off the cormorant's head. "See, I told you, Gracie, didn't I? He just wants to be friendly, that's all." And he dropped to his knees in the sand. "Come on, we've got to thank him, haven't we?" We never spoke a word after that, but knelt in the sand together and collected all the shells we were going to need. Then I wrote out in orange shells, "Thanks for the cormorant," and both of us signed our names in shells underneath. We stayed all day, sailing our boats on Rushy Bay, and even when Daniel suggested the sea was getting too rough, I insisted we stayed on, just to prove to myself, to him and to the birdman, that I was no longer frightened. True, I did keep my eye on Heathy Hill, but now I was almost hoping the birdman would come down to the beach with his dog. He did not come, however, and my newfound courage was not put to the test. Not yet, anyway. As we left the beach, Daniel cupped his hands to his mouth and called out, "Goodbye," in the direction of the cottage, and I waved with him because I felt sure the birdman would be watching us. Back in Daniel's boat shed that evening, we stood by his workbench and examined the cormorant closely. "One day, Gracie," he said, "one day I'm going to be able to make something like that." "What happens if somebody finds it?" I asked. "What are we going to say?" "Just tell them I made it," he said, laughing, "but they may not believe us. So better if they don't find it. I haven't got a room of my own to hide it, and I haven't got anywhere to put anything, not anywhere private anyway. You've got a room of your own, Gracie. You can keep it, it'll be safer with you. If Father finds it, he'll only want to know where it comes from, and Big Tim will torture me till I tell him." And he handed the cormorant carefully to me. I already knew where I would hide it. I was only worried about how I was going to get it there without being discovered. "I've been thinking, Gracie," Daniel said. "He gave us this cormorant to show us how friendly he was, didn't he? So we've got to do the same, haven't we? We've got to give him something back so he knows what we want to be friends as well. I've been thinking, do you think he'd like it if we made one of our boats?" "We could call her Woodcock, couldn't we?" I said. "We've got to name it after a bird, like all the others are. Woodcock's a kind of bird, isn't it?" "Never seen one," said Daniel, "but I think it is." And so we went home that evening with the birdman's cormorant. I went home that evening with the birdman's cormorant stuffed inside my blouse. Mother paid no attention as I came in. She was busy over the stove, and I reached the safety of my room without her even seeing me. We built Woodcock together that spring, but it was nearly summer before she was ready for launching. We'd never taken so much trouble over a boat as we did with Woodcock. Nothing was ever right until it was perfect. We took her to Rushy Bay for her trials and pushed her out towards Samson Island. She danced out over the waves, her sail catching the wind, and leaning her over so that she sped out to sea. I think she might have gone all the way to Samson had we not waded waist high into the water after her and brought her back. She was quite magnificent, with her shiny blue hull, her white stripe and her red brick sail. Daniel was satisfied. So we left her beached well above the high water mark, and we left too a long message from the birdman in the sand, and it read, "We named this boat Woodcock. May God bless her and all who sail in her," and we signed it Daniel and Gracie. We waited until sundown in the purple humming heather on Sampson Hill to see if the birdman would come for it, but he never came. We could not stay any longer, for Mother always liked me to be home before dark. But first thing the next morning we went back to Rushy Bay and found the boat was gone. In its place there was a message. "Thanks. Beautiful." And underneath, Zachariah Woodcock.